night falls and the darkness creeps in, the world around us changes. Shadows seem to grow longer and the silence becomes deafening. But what happens when the silence is broken by the sound of footsteps that don't belong to anyone you know? What happens when you hear a whisper in your ear, but there's no one there? Welcome to our world of horror, where the unknown is the only certainty and fear is the only emotion. Brace yourself, because the journey we're about to take is not for the faint of heart. The Haunting of Millfield. The old house on the hill had been abandoned for years, but it still managed to loom over the town, casting a long and eerie shadow. It was said that the house had a dark history, and that those who had lived there before had met terrible ends. But the rumors didn't stop a group of teenagers from daring each other to spend the night inside the house. At first, the teenagers laughed and joked as they made their way up the hill. But as they got closer to the house, they began to feel a sense of unease. The wind howled through the trees, and the house seemed to loom over them like a giant monster. But they pressed on, determined to prove their bravery. The house was in a state of disrepair, with peeling wallpaper and broken floorboards. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The teenagers made their way from room to room, laughing and poking fun at each other, but as the night wore on, things began to change. The wind outside picked up, causing the windows to rattle in their frames. Strange noises could be heard coming from the walls, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. It wasn't long before the teenagers realized that they were no longer alone in the house. One by one, they began to disappear. One of the girls went to use the bathroom and never came back. Another boy went to investigate a strange noise and was never seen again. Panic set in as the remaining teenagers realized that they were in grave danger. As the night wore on, the fear in the house grew stronger. The remaining teenagers huddled together, too afraid to move or speak. They could hear strange footsteps coming from the hallway, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Just as the teenagers thought that all hope was lost, they heard a voice calling out to them from outside. It was a group of police officers who had been tipped off about their reckless behavior. The teenagers rushed outside, sobbing and shaking with fear. As the police officers looked around the house, they found signs of a struggle and evidence that the teenagers were not alone. The house was sealed off and investigated, but no trace of the missing teenagers was ever found. The legend of the old house on the hill lived on, and the town's residents avoided the area at all costs. The teenagers who had dared to enter the house that night never spoke of their experience again, haunted by the memories of what had happened there. The house remained abandoned, a constant reminder of the terror that had taken place within its walls. For generations, the graveyard had been a place of reverence and respect. The townspeople took great care to maintain it, ensuring that it was a peaceful resting place for their loved ones. But when a new family moved into the nearby mansion, everything changed. At first, the townspeople welcomed the family with open arms, eager to make new friends. But as the days went by, they began to notice something odd. The family would often take a shortcut through the graveyard, cutting across the graves as if they were nothing more than a path. It wasn't long before strange things started to happen. Graves were found disturbed, and tombstones were knocked over. The townspeople assumed that it was just a group of unruly teenagers causing mischief, but as the disturbances continued, they realized that there was something more sinister at work. Eerie noises could be heard at night, and some people claimed to have seen strange figures moving among the graves. But it wasn't until the family's youngest daughter disappeared that the townspeople realized the terrible truth. The graveyard was cursed, and anyone who dared to disturb it would pay the ultimate price. The town was in a state of panic, and the local authorities were called in to investigate. They combed through the graveyard, looking for any sign of the missing girl, but their efforts were in vain. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. As the weeks went by, the disturbances in the graveyard grew worse. Graves were dug up, and bones were found scattered among the graves. It was as if something was trying to escape from the earth. The townspeople banded together, desperate to find a way to break the curse. They consulted with local mystics and spiritual leaders, and eventually, they came up with a plan. They would perform a ritual to appease the spirits of the graveyard and beg for forgiveness. On the night of the ritual, the townspeople gathered at the edge of the graveyard, their faces pale and anxious. They could feel the weight of the curse bearing down on them, and they knew that they were taking a great risk. But as the ritual began, something unexpected happened. The earth beneath their feet began to shake, and the sky above them grew dark. Strange figures appeared in the distance, and the townspeople realized that they were surrounded by the spirits of the dead. For hours, they begged for forgiveness, promising to restore the graveyard to its former glory. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual was over. The spirits were appeased, and the curse was lifted. The town breathed a sigh of relief, but the memory of the curse lingered on. The graveyard was never quite the same again, and many of the townspeople still avoided it after dark. But the curse was broken, and the missing girl was never found. Her fate remained a mystery, a reminder of the terrible price that could be paid for disturbing the dead. The abandoned asylum had long been a source of fascination for the townspeople. The towering building stood on the outskirts of town, a dark and foreboding presence that seemed to watch over the surrounding countryside. For years, it had been left to crumble and decay, a relic of a time when mental illness was poorly understood and often treated with cruelty. But for a group of urban explorers, the abandoned asylum was the perfect place to explore. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they made their way through the dark and musty hallways, eager to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within. At first, everything seemed normal. The explorers found old medical equipment and rusted metal beds, remnants of a bygone era. But as they ventured deeper into the asylum, things started to change. The air grew colder, and strange whispers could be heard in the shadows. The explorers began to feel as if they were being watched, and they could sense a malevolent presence lurking just beyond their sight. One of the explorers, a young woman named Emily, suddenly found herself separated from the group. She called out to them, but no one answered. She tried to retrace her steps, but the corridors seemed to have shifted, leading her deeper into the heart of the asylum. As she stumbled through the darkness, Emily began to feel a sense of dread growing inside her. She could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, and she knew that she was not alone. Suddenly, she heard a scream from one of the other explorers. It was a sound of pure terror, and it sent shivers down her spine. She ran towards the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived, she found the other explorers huddled in a corner, their faces pale with fear. One of them was missing, and they could hear the sound of his footsteps echoing through the halls. But it was no longer the sound of a human being, it was the sound of something else entirely. The explorers tried to make their way back to the entrance, but the corridors seemed to shift and change, leading them deeper into the heart of the asylum. They could hear the sound of laughter and whispered voices, and they knew that they were in grave danger. Just as they thought that all hope was lost, they saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a group of police officers who had been tipped off about their reckless behavior. The explorers rushed towards them, sobbing and shaking with fear. As the police officers looked around the asylum, they found signs of a struggle and evidence that the explorers were not alone. The asylum was sealed off and investigated, but no trace of the missing explorer was ever found. The legend of the abandoned asylum lived on, and the townspeople avoided the area at all costs. The explorers who had dared to enter the asylum that night never spoke of their experience again, haunted by the memories of what had happened there. The asylum remained abandoned, a constant reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The old Victorian mansion had always been the talk of the town, with its Gothic architecture and imposing presence. But for newlyweds David and Sarah, it was the perfect place to start their new life together. They had purchased the mansion at a bargain price, eager to fix it up and turn it into their dream home. They spent countless hours painting, sanding, and restoring the crumbling walls and fixtures. But as they worked on the house, they began to notice strange things happening. At first, it was just small things, like doors closing on their own and the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. Sarah began to feel as if she was being watched, and she could sense a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. David, too, began to feel a sense of unease, and he found himself constantly on edge. One night, Sarah woke up to find that she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, with an overwhelming feeling of terror washing over her. She could see a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed, its eyes fixed on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Finally, the figure disappeared, and Sarah was able to move again. She shook David awake, telling him what had happened. But he just brushed it off, telling her that it was just her imagination. But the incidents continued to escalate, and the couple found themselves in a living nightmare. They could hear strange noises coming from the walls, and they found objects moved or missing. One night, David woke up to find that he was covered in scratches, with no memory of how they got there. Sarah, too, had bruises on her arms and legs, as if someone had been holding her down. They knew that they had to do something, so they contacted a paranormal investigator. The investigator conducted an extensive investigation of the mansion, using equipment to detect any unusual activity. What they discovered was beyond anything they could have imagined. The investigator found evidence of a violent murder that had taken place in the mansion over a century ago. It was believed that the victim's spirit was still trapped in the house, unable to rest until justice was served. David and Sarah were terrified, but they knew that they had to do something to put the spirit to rest. They conducted their own research, poring over old records and documents until they finally discovered the truth behind the murder. Armed with this information, they performed a ritual to release the spirit from its earthly bounds. It was a risky move, but it worked. The couple watched as the spirit vanished into the night, feeling a sense of relief wash over them. After that night, the mansion was calm and peaceful. David and Sarah were able to turn it into their dream home, and they lived there happily for many years. But they never forgot the horror that they had experienced, and they always made sure to acknowledge the spirit that they had helped to release. It was a dark and stormy night, and the power had gone out in the small town of Millfield. The streets were empty, and the only sounds were the howling wind and the pounding rain. But something else was lurking in the darkness, something that would change the town forever. In a small house on the outskirts of town, a group of friends had gathered for a Halloween party. They were all dressed in elaborate costumes, sipping drinks and listening to spooky music. They had decided to make the most of the power outage, and they had even set up a small haunted house in the basement. As the night wore on, the group began to hear strange noises coming from upstairs. At first, they brushed it off as the wind, but then they heard something that sounded like footsteps. They all looked at each other, a feeling of unease settling in. They decided to investigate, slowly making their way up the creaky stairs. As they reached the top, they could see a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and menacing, with glowing eyes and sharp claws. The group froze, unsure of what to do. The figure stepped forward, and they could see that it was wearing a costume, but it was unlike any costume they had ever seen. It was as if the costume had come to life. The figure lunged at them, and the group scattered, running in different directions. They could hear the figure chasing after them, its footsteps echoing through the halls. They realized that they were in a fight for their lives, and they had to find a way to escape. One by one, the group was picked off, until only 2 were left. They made their way to the basement, hoping to find a way out. But the figure was right behind them, its breathing hot on their necks. They reached the door to the outside, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The figure approached them, and they prepared for the worst. But just as it was about to strike, the power came back on, and the figure vanished. The 2 friends collapsed in relief, gasping for air. They had survived the horror, but they knew that they would never forget the terror that they had experienced. The next day, the town was buzzing with rumors about what had happened. Some people claimed that they had seen the figure stalking through the streets, while others dismissed it as just a Halloween prank gone wrong. But the 2 friends knew the truth. They had encountered something that was beyond explanation, something that had changed them forever. They knew that they would never be able to forget the horror that they had experienced, and they hoped that no one else would have to go through the same thing. The events of that Halloween night became a cautionary tale in Millfield, a reminder that sometimes the things that scare us the most are the things that are just beyond our understanding. The town never forgot the horror of that night, and the 2 friends remained haunted by the experience for the rest of their lives.